Good evening. My name is Andrew Rosbicki. I'm a Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Alabama. On behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, I would like to welcome you to the 2014 Mahan Lecture. The Mahan Lecture was inaugurated in 2001, and it is now in our 13th anniversary of this outstanding event in our college. This lecture series is generously supported by the University of South Alabama Foundation and named for the History Department founding chair. Dr. Howard Mann has always been interested in history education, and we look upon this lecture series as a form of public outreach to the Mobile community. The aim of the lecture is to invite first-rate historians that have studied subjects of broad interest and importance. The subject of each lecture alternates between the US and non-US topic. This year we'll have an opportunity to hear a talk on the US history subject. Now I would like to invite Ms. Maxie Roberts, Managing Director of the USA Foundation, to welcome you on behalf of the Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Worsbicky. And on behalf of the Board of Directors of the USA Foundation and all of us with the Foundation, we are honored to be a part of the 2014 Howard F. Mann Lecture. The faculty in the Department of History, Dr. Clarence Moore, the chair of the Department of History, the College of Arts and Sciences and Academic Affairs, all ensure that this is an outstanding lecture year after year, and you have a treat this evening as well. As Dr. Worsbicky said, Howard Mann was instrumental in so many things related to this university and to the Department of History, in the founding and the development of the university, in challenging us, whether colleagues or faculty or friends or students, in education and in continuing education. And lest we not forget that challenge and that necessary spark of spirit for education, Dr. Mann, upon his death, established the Mann-Brandon Fund in the USA Foundation for the Gender Studies program at the University of South Alabama. For more than 4 decades, Howard Mann was a great teacher, a great friend, a great supporter of the University of South Alabama. And likewise, for about 3 decades, Dr. Betty Brandon, his equal and side-by-side partner, served as a superlative faculty member in the Department of History, provided great support to the University of South Alabama, and really nurtured the Gender Studies program. This lecture embodies the quest for knowledge that was Howard Mann. And so tonight we have an exceptional opportunity to participate in that, to learn, to question, to continue to pursue that knowledge in the spirit of Howard Mann. So with that, I would not introduce, but I would ask Dr. Clarence Moore to come forward because he will introduce the speaker. Clarence.
Thank you, Maxie. My remarks will be pretty brief tonight. Many of you will already know that this lecture is named after the late Howard Mann, as Maxie just said. And during his lifetime, he attended every one of these lectures, as did Betty. And Betty is here tonight, I believe. Where are you, Betty? Stand up. My hat is off to you. Betty drove down here from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, So that's a considerable drive if any of you have ever made it. And also, just to reiterate what Maxie said, Betty Ann Howard collectively devoted a large number of years of service, not only to the history department, but to the university. And the university will be in their debt for a very long time for that. Speaking for the history department, I can tell Betty that she's greatly missed on the 3rd floor of the Humanities Building, and we glad to see you here tonight. Our speaker tonight is Professor Patrick J. Maney of Boston College. I should say at the outset that I met Patrick in 1981 when we were both new faculty in New Orleans teaching in the history department at Tulane University. Over the next 17 years, as we shared the ups and downs of academic life below sea level, I developed a profound respect for Patrick's leadership, his scholarly acumen, and an even deeper appreciation for his friendship and his uncompromising personal integrity. If Patrick were running for office, he would certainly have my vote and my willing, if necessarily modest, financial support. A native of Wisconsin, Professor Maney received his undergraduate degree at Wisconsin State University in Whitewater, as it was then called. He completed his graduate training, his doctoral training, at the University of Maryland, where he studied with the distinguished political historian Sam Merrill. After graduation, he had the, I think, extremely valuable experience of serving for 3 years as a legislative aide to a senior member of the Wisconsin Senate. And that, I think, is good training for a historian who has worked on the subjects that he's worked on. That experience, together with his extensive research in the records of the U.S. Senate, gave him rare insight into the workings of the American legislative process. His first book, a biography of Robert M. La Follette, Jr., the son of the famous progressive senator from Wisconsin, and the model for the leading character in Alan Drury's novel Advise and Consent, that book won high praise for its careful research, its trenchant analysis, and its vivid recreation of a tragic Cold War drama. Elected to the Senate in 1925, the younger La Follette, a steadfast defender of civil liberties, revived the Progressive Party in Wisconsin, but was defeated by Joe McCarthy after rejoining the Republican fold in 1946. A leading isolationist, his suicide in 1953 has been attributed to McCarthy's scurrilous attacks, although the connection between the two events remains open to debate. In many ways, the younger La Follette's career linked the progressive reforms of his father's day with the liberal agenda of the New Deal. That connection is developed in Maney's second book, The Roosevelt Presence, a work that deftly explores the development of FDR's personal style and his enduring and powerful impact on national consciousness, while also reminding us of the New Deal's heavy debt to Congress as the actual source of many New Deal programs. Maney's sure-handed treatment of these and other subjects led Professor Anthony Badger of Cambridge University, a previous Mann lecturer, to praise the Roosevelt Presence as, quote, easily the most thoughtful, politically astute, and historiographically up-to-date work of its kind. At the present time, Professor Maney is completing a biography of Bill Clinton, whose presidency is the subject of tonight's talk. Although journalists and Washington insiders and others have written extensively, if not always candidly, about Clinton, Professor Maney will be the first scholar to approach the former president with the historian's perspective, asking what his 2 terms represent in the evolution of the Democratic Party and the ebb and flow of American political sentiments, what the late Arthur Schlesinger Jr. called the cycles of American history. This, one need hardly say, is a large subject with major economic and cultural as well as political dimensions. So without further delay, I present to you this evening's speaker, my former colleague and longtime friend, Patrick Maney.
After teaching at Tulane, I taught for 10 years at the University of South Carolina. And not long before I left South Carolina to go to Boston, I was invited to give a talk about Franklin Roosevelt to a Rotary Club. My host introduced me as someone who was working on the Clinton presidency. And at the very mention of Clinton's name, the audience burst into boos. I mean, it was good-natured in part, but also serious. And I got up there and I said, you know, I have not even started this project. You don't have any idea what I'm going to say. How could you possibly boo me? You know, what a difference a decade makes. I just saw recently a poll where 60% of the public, not only 60% of Democrats, but 60% of the public had a favorable impression of Bill Clinton. And of course, Hillary Clinton appears ready to run for the presidency. It's largely forgotten today how controversial the Clintons were when he was president. Let me read you something that a journalist wrote. One of the most extraordinary phenomena of our day, a phenomenon which social historians in the future will very likely record with perplexity, if not with astonishment, is the fanatical hatred of the president, which today obsesses thousands of men and women. No other word than hatred will do. It is a passion, a fury that is wholly unreasonable. It goes far beyond objections to politics or programs. It is a consuming personal hatred of the president and to an almost equal degree of the First Lady. Actually, that was written in 1936, and it was about Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. But the very same things could easily have been said about Bill and Hillary Clinton. How, after all, to explain that a large number of people, including respected members of Congress, came to believe that the Clintons had helped arrange the murder of their longtime friend Vince Foster in order to cover up a scandal. On the other side, there were fervent supporters of the Clintons, and you may recall novelist Toni Morrison's characterization of Bill Clinton as the first black president. With my experience with the Rotary Club in mind, I want to sort of thank you for your warm reception. I didn't hear any boos yet, anyway. I'm delighted to be here. Clarence Moore is one of my oldest and closest friends and colleagues, and ever since he's been here, I really have come to admire what he's done, really what you have done. The Katrina Conference, this distinguished lecture series, I sort of accept myself from that. And it's not only gotten my notice, but I can tell you that other people in the history profession have seen what you are doing. So I want to congratulate you for that. All right. Bill Clinton's quest for the presidency coincided with America's rediscovery of the Gilded Age, that late 19th century era unforgettably chronicled by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner. Twain and Warner conjured up the image of a nation glittery on the outside, but cheap and tawdry once you scratched the surface. They may also have been invoking Shakespeare, who wrote that to gild refined gold, to paint the lily, is wasteful and ridiculous excess. In any case, before Clinton and before the early 1990s, the Gilded Age was largely of interest to history buffs and devotees of writers like Mark Twain and Edith Wharton and O. Henry. It was something you might hear about in a history class and then quickly forget. About all that most people remembered of the Gilded Age were those fabulous mansions that were built, many of which survive to the present time. As late as the 1980s, if you visited New York City, you could, for $4, take a guided tour of Millionaire's Row, the stretch of Fifth Avenue between 78th and 91st Streets, once the domain of the Vanderbilts, Whitneys, and the Mellons. Or you could visit the Breakers, the Vanderbilt 70-room Italian villa in Newport, Rhode Island, where Gilded Age reenactors ride the grounds in ornate horse-drawn carriages that were all the rage in the late 19th century. Closer to home, you may have been to the Vanderbilt's Biltmore estate in Asheville, which with its like 174 rooms makes the Breakers in Rhode Island look like a cottage. We used to, when we lived in South Carolina, we frequently would take visitors to Biltmore, and it was kind of a fun how the other half lived coupling, that we would go to Biltmore one day and then also see the home, the farm of Carl Sandburg, the famous folklorist and writer. And there was even a restaurant. I mean, there was even a museum in Palm Beach that offered patrons a fixed price Gilded Age lunch, whatever that would be. But just as Clinton was embarking on his presidential campaign in the early 90s, interest in the Gilded Age took a much more serious turn. Commentators began to note disturbing similarities between the Gilded Age and their own time. Dramatic and unsettling change, growing income inequality, conspicuous consumption, racial and ethnic tensions, government largesse for the rich and well-born, and in politics, scandals, real and trumped up, and partisan warfare out of proportion to the actual differences between the parties. They had, in the late 19th century, they had their millionaires' row in Biltmore Estate. By the 90s, we had our Trump Towers, McMansions, and gated communities. It was enough to constitute a second Gilded Age. Too many stretch limousines in Manhattan, too many yacht jams off Newport Beach, and too many fur coats at Aspen. One-time conservative activist Kevin Phillips complained in 1990, noting that during the 1980s, the number of millionaires had tripled, while the median family income had budged hardly at all. In both ages, economic forces were in the driver's seat, presidents and politicians along for the ride. Of the original Gilded Age, the great American historian Richard Hofstadter once wrote this. He said, "There is no other period in the nation's history when politics seemed so completely dwarfed by economic changes, none in which the life of the country rests so completely in the hands of the industrial entrepreneur. The industrialists of the Gilded Age," there he was thinking of the Carnegies, Rockefellers, and J.P. Morgan, "the industrialists of the Gilded Age," he said, "were men of heroic audacity and magnificent exploitive talents, shrewd, energetic, aggressive, rapacious, domineering, insatiable. From them, the era took its tone and its color." Changed the industrial references to high tech, wrote columnist E.J. Dionne, and Hofstadter's description of 19th century America sounds like a brilliant evocation of our own 1980s and 90s. Since then, any number of commentators have extended the Gilded Age analogy to the present time. Just in the recent issue of the New Republic magazine, historian Jackson Lears writes sort of matter-of-factly, "It is no secret that we are living in a second Gilded Age, another era like the first of corrupt rule by plutocratic elites." Now, let me get to Clinton. Why is the Gilded Age a useful lens through which to view his presidency? Because that's how he viewed his presidency. Among modern presidents, I mean, this has been a surprise to me, Clinton had an impressive, though totally unpretentious grasp of history. He was, for one thing, always comparing himself to his predecessors, only to complain that he was not getting credit for outperforming many of them. But more significantly, Clinton had a vision really rare among presidents of how his times were connected to the past and how his times might play out in the future. I mean, the only 20th century presidents that had anything like a similar historic sensibility, I think, were Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, John Kennedy, and Richard Nixon. Clinton returned to the Gilded Age in speeches and in writings time after time, as well as to the progressive era that followed. He thought those times were most like his own in all of American history, with useful lessons for the present. To Clinton, the defining characteristic of both ages, his age and the earlier one, was change, and not just ordinary change, but change so vast and far-reaching it only happened a few times in American history. But when it did happen, society was fundamentally restructured, and the way people lived and worked was changed forever. Policy wonk that he was, Clinton employed the jargon of social scientists to describe the change he had in mind. He said it was nothing less than a paradigm shift. During the Gilded Age, America went from being an insular agrarian nation to being an urban industrial giant. A century later, Clinton was convinced a comparable transformation was underway. We're going from the industrial age to an information technology age, from the Cold War to a global society, he said, and with similar results. For, he added, the current transformation has brought enormous changes in the way people work and live. It is attended by a large increase in immigration and an increasing diversity in America, with all the tensions that brings. There are vast fortunes being made. People are having opportunities they never dreamed of, but a lot of people have been dislocated. What did Clinton learn from the past that might be of use to his present? Namely, that the Industrial Revolution had been worth it in the long run. Now, one of the differences between Clinton and other commentators, he saw positive things in the Industrial Revolution and in the Gilded Age. He believed that the Industrial Revolution had allowed mankind to achieve things for people on a scale never seen before. So he thought the Industrial Revolution was worth it in the long run, but not at the cost of children working 60 hours a week, women being exploited in the workplace, or small businesses being driven out by monopolies. Eventually, government had to step in to ease the transition, and he thought it was no different today. For all the benefits of an information age and computers and cell phones, and also a global society, government would have to step in from time to time to smooth out the rough edges. Government would need to improve education and provide job training so that Americans would be able to better compete with workers in other countries. Government would need to reform health care so that Americans wouldn't be held back by having to worry about spiraling medical costs. At the same time, he was convinced that there was no turning back the clock. Change was here to stay. A fundamental transformation was underway, and the sooner Americans accepted it and adapted to it, the sooner they would enjoy its benefits. That's why, for example, he made NAFTA, that free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, and other trade agreements, a priority. There might be jobs lost and some hardships in the short run, but he said that almost everybody would benefit in the long run. That was also his thinking behind a reform in banking and finance. The Glass-Steagall Act, the 1930s New Deal law that separated commercial from investment banking, was outmoded, he believed. It was preventing American banks from competing in a global financial market. By the way, the Glass-Steagall was repealed, and as some of you know, it's very controversial today. Some have attributed its repeal to the financial crisis of 2008. It was not, I should hasten to add, it was not particularly controversial at the time. It passed by overwhelming margins in both houses. And as an aside, your Senator Shelby was one of the very few, one of only 6 opponents, I think, in the U.S. Senate. Interviewed by the editors of The Atlantic magazine midway through his presidency, Clinton was hopeful that the United States could get through the current transformation more quickly and with less disruption than a century earlier. His Atlantic interviewers weren't quite so sure. He was reassuring and upbeat in manner, they observed, but beneath his action plan seemed to be a fatalistic awareness that this transition would be wrenching, like the one a century ago that accompanied the rise of unions and mass production. Historians now take the presidents of that first Gilded Age more seriously than they once did. No longer are the White House occupants, from Rutherford B. Hayes to William McKinley, treated as interchangeable non-entities. Some Gilded Age presidents, it's clear, were abler and more influential than others. Even so, most historians would agree that none left an indelible mark on his time or place or significantly altered the course of American history. None exerted the influence of Washington or Jefferson or Jackson or Lincoln. They are largely forgotten men, writes one historian, because so little was expected of them. The presidents of our Gilded Age, I would say the presidents from Jimmy Carter through Bill Clinton up to and including Barack Obama, are of a different breed. They've been far more engaged and certainly haven't suffered from low expectations. Indeed, ever since Franklin Roosevelt's time, expectations for presidents have been high, if not unrealistic. Yet, it's my hunch that 50 years from now, historians will treat the presidents of our age in much the same way that they treat the presidents of the late 19th century. For one thing, future historians are likely to find that the presidents of our Gilded Age are better understood as a group rather than as individuals. That's because modern presidents, from Jimmy Carter on, whatever their other differences, have shared similar economic philosophies. They've been more market-oriented than most of their immediate predecessors, more supportive of deregulation, and more inclined to elevate supply over demand as the engine of economic growth. Economically speaking, Bill Clinton is closer to Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan or the Bushes, father and son, than he is to Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, or even Richard Nixon. Of Clinton's deregulatory policies, a lobbyist representing small banks once said Teddy Roosevelt would be rolling over in his grave. Future historians are likely also to note that none of the presidents of Clinton's cohort, some were better, more effective than others for sure, but none of them achieved the distinction or exerted the influence of a half a dozen or so of their 20th century predecessors. There are no Roosevelts, Theodore or Franklin, no Woodrow Wilsons, no Harry Trumans or Lyndon Johnsons in their ranks. It is not their fault, despite our fixation on the White House, and a fixation it is, the flywheel of contemporary history is revolving beyond the Oval Office. Put another way, we've been looking in the wrong place. The 24-hour news hour and so-called presidential historians, I might add an academic species that was non-existent before the 1990s, dog a president's every step and chronicle his every misstep. We begin speculating about the next president even as the current president is being sworn into office. But in our age, the presidency has not always been where the action is. During my career, historians, I think, have done a pretty good job writing history from the bottom up, chronicling the experiences not just of kings and presidents, but also of ordinary men and women, and also talking about the broad kind of impersonal forces that shape history. Yet when it comes to our national politics, we still seem fixated on the White House. I asked one of Clinton's economic advisors this question. I said, I know you can't quantify it, but how much influence does a president have over the economy? The advisor, then and now an admirer of President Clinton, praised his economic stewardship as prudent and wise. But the advisor also said that if the elder Bush had been reelected in 1992, the economy probably would have performed, and it performed well, but probably would have performed about the same, and for two reasons. First, there wasn't a lot of difference between the economic views of Clinton and Bush. Both favored freer trade. Remember, NAFTA, the trade agreement, originated under Bush and was completed by Clinton. Both favored deregulation of business and industry and also welfare reform. Their differences were more of degree than kind. But second, and more important, it wasn't the government that drove the economy during the 1990s. It was the emergence of the computer and telecommunications industries and the internet that did it. Now, don't get me wrong, Bill Clinton made much, though perhaps not all he could have, of the more limited circumstances in which he found himself. Anyone even vaguely familiar with the history of health care could have predicted the long odds facing the Clintons' proposed reform. But who could have predicted his success in refashioning the Democratic Party along centrist lines, or his ability to neutralize hot-button issues like crime and welfare with which Republicans had been bludgeoning Democrats for decades? And who, in the aftermath of the 1994 off-year election in which Republicans took control of both houses of Congress, who would ever have imagined that Clinton would go on to re-election comfortably in 1996, would survive impeachment, and would finish out his second term with the highest public approval rating of any modern president? A recent action by the Georgia legislature reminds me of another notable event in the Clinton presidency. As you may know, the Georgia legislature, I think this week maybe, has made it easier to carry handguns into bars, airports, schools, and churches, though I guess you still have to get permission from the church to come armed to a Sunday service. It's worth remembering that the last significant federal gun control legislation, the Brady Bill, and a partial ban on assault weapons, occurred during the Clinton administration. Whether you're pro-gun or for control, you have to admit that given the passions of the subject, that's no small feat. Clinton's successes were even more impressive in view of the odds against him. No mandate, he was elected both times with a minority of the vote. A weak political base, perhaps the most relentless opposition faced by any president since FDR, and no great crisis around which to mobilize public opinion. He also significantly opened the presidency to American popular culture in a way that made it more relevant to people's lives. As the New York Times reporter Todd Purdom put it, Clinton made the modern presidency more understandable and approachable, and eliminated a substantial measure of the distance that had insulated the office and its occupants. That he did so in the face of persistent anti-government sentiment is even more remarkable. The first baby boomer to occupy the White House, no matter who it was bound to alter public perceptions of the office. Yet, it's hard to imagine others of Clinton's generation connecting with popular culture quite as effectively as he did. I mean, can you imagine like Al Gore or George W. Bush or Newt Gingrich, for example, appearing with shades and a saxophone on Arsenio Hall's talk show to play his rendition of Heartbreak Hotel, or doing an Elvis impersonation on Imus in the Morning, or identifying his underwear preferences on MTV, or inspiring a best-selling novel, Primary Colors, a major film of the same name, and a fabulously popular television series, West Wing. You know, I was just, in terms of popular culture, I was thinking of last week about Clinton when Barack Obama made his foray into popular culture by appearing on that web-based program, Between Two Ferns. I don't know if you saw that or not. Every so often, a president has to refurbish the image of the presidency to keep it relevant. Roosevelt did it in the 1930s, Kennedy in the 1960s, Reagan, with his star quality and image consciousness, did it in the 80s, and Clinton, I think, did it in the 90s. But, and here's really my point. There is a world of difference between refurbishing an office's image and guiding the economic destiny of a great nation. And the latter, Clinton was not able to do. It was beyond his, or I think any president's power to do in this age. Maybe that is why Clinton chose to concentrate as much as he did on foreign policy during his presidency. To my surprise, his foreign policy was much more consequential than I remembered. I knew about Somalia and Bosnia and Kosovo and the expansion of NATO, of course, but there was much more. After a stumbling start, the administration devised a plausible strategic substitute for the containment policy that had guided U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. Formulated by National Security Advisor Anthony Lake, the new strategy called for the U.S. commitment to the enlargement of the world's free market democracies. The administration also devised, I think, a logical checklist of sorts to determine when and under what circumstances the United States would participate in international peacekeeping operations. More controversially, Clinton expanded the president's power to make war without the authority of Congress. And he actually anticipated some of his successors' tactics in the post-9/11 war on terror and in Iraq. We tend to associate with the presidency of George W. Bush the controversial practice of extraordinary rendition. That authorizes U.S. officials to apprehend suspected terrorists on foreign soil and then to send them to countries like Syria and Egypt for interrogation and incarceration. There's no question what the Bush administration expanded the practice, but it was begun under Clinton. Moreover, Clinton also laid at least some of the groundwork for the invasion of Iraq by accusing, in the mid-90s, by accusing Saddam Hussein of harboring weapons of mass destruction and by calling for his removal from power. To observe the long reach of Clinton's foreign policy, one need only look at the drama being played out in Crimea and Ukraine, which is not unrelated, I don't think, to Clinton's decision to extend NATO membership to some former Soviet satellites. There are echoes of the first Gilded Age here as well. For all their inaction at home, recall that it was under the last of the Gilded Age presidents, William McKinley, that the United States broke out of its isolationist shell by entering the Spanish-American War and acquiring an empire of sorts with the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Although foreign policy may actually have been Clinton's most concrete legacy, he was never able to place his personal stamp on foreign policy, with the result that even today, people, when they think of the Clinton administration, foreign policy would often be the last thing they would think about. From the beginning, he pestered his staff to come up with a compelling word or phrase that would encapsulate the administration's approach to international affairs in the same way that containment had during the Cold War. National Security Advisor Anthony Lake suggested enlargement, short for the administration's goal of seeking the enlargement of the world's free community of market democracies, but engagement never made it as a key word, maybe because there was something sort of slightly off color about it, something you might hear about in an infomercial on late night television. The White House advisors even reached out to George F. Kennan, the architect of containment, who had coined that word in relationship to policy toward the Soviet Union. Forget it, Kennan said. He advised Clinton's advisors to produce a couple of paragraphs, a thoughtful paragraph or two, but not a bumper sticker. He said you just can't encapsulate something as complicated as foreign policy in a word or a phrase. Told about the exchange, Clinton laughed and said, well, that's why Kennan's a great diplomat and scholar, but not a politician. And there was some wisdom in that. Clinton understood that in order to lead, you have to be able to present ideas in a compelling, concrete way that the country will understand. Similarly, Clinton struggled to find a memorable way to describe his goal of leading the country from the industrial age to the information age and into the global economy. Early on, he used the phrase "the third way" to suggest his rejection of the orthodoxies of the right and the left. Though popular with members of the Democratic Leadership Council, a centrist organization that played a role in his rise to power, as well as it was also popular with Britain's Tony Blair, the phrase "like engagement" never caught on. It smacked too much of down the middle, split the difference approach rather than a compelling view of the future. Then a little bit later came the vital center, lifted from historian Arthur Schlesinger's famous liberal manifesto in the early years of the Cold War. Next was the New Covenant. Now that didn't make it. Finally, his speechwriters came up with a metaphor of a bridge to the 21st century. Accepting his party's nomination in 1996, Clinton said, "Tonight, let us resolve to build that bridge to the 21st century, to meet our challenges, protect our basic values, and prepare our people for the future." 4 years later, it was mission accomplished. At the 2000 convention that nominated Al Gore, Clinton said, perhaps a little prematurely, he said, "My fellow Americans, tonight we can say with gratitude and humility, we built our bridge to the 21st century, we crossed that bridge together, and we're not going back." It got some attention at the time, but it did not have the staying power that Clinton had hoped. Now, well before the end of his presidency, Clinton was giving a lot of thought to his historical reputation. He knew that the top shelf of great presidents would forever be occupied by the Trinity, Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. He doubtless reasoned that that second tier of near greats was probably also out of reach. But how could he not possibly make the above average category? You can imagine how disappointed he was in December 1996 when, after his triumphal re-election, when the New York Times published a poll of prominent historians and political scientists ranking him squarely in the average category with the likes of Benjamin Harrison, Chester A. Arthur, and William Howard Taft. Especially galling was the fact that two two presidents from the original Gilded Age, Grover Cleveland and William McKinley, were at a higher level. A short time later, Doris Kearns Goodwin, one of the historians who had voted in the poll, found herself seated next to Clinton at a White House dinner. He was, she recalled, inconsolable. Doris Kearns Goodwin, as some of you may know, is an avid Boston Red Sox fan, and so to lighten the president's mood, she noted that the Major League Baseball was threatened with a strike that would wipe out the following season. So she said if he could prevent the strike from taking place, she would change her vote in his favor. He was not amused. One of the reasons for Clinton's inability, for his less than stellar ratings, was his inability to project really a clear sense of direction, even though he tried. He had a vision, a rare vision, but was unable to express it in compelling terms. If you look at some of our most difficult times, he said in a really self-revelatory moment to an audience, he said, if you look at some of our most difficult times, they're the ones of transition, when we're moving from one era to another and people can't give you a clear map. He recalled his grandfather telling him that as poor as people were in the Great Depression, there was a certain happiness of spirit felt after Roosevelt got in, and everybody knew that they were working together and that they were going somewhere. FDR's goals, though daunting, were clear-cut: end the Depression and win the war. Similarly, during the Cold War, the goal was equally clear: contain the Soviet Union. Presidents might argue over the means by which to carry out containment, but the ultimate goal was never in doubt. But how was Clinton to provide a roadmap out of the second Gilded Age into this new information age and global society? Margaret Sullivan, the public editor of the New York Times, recently gave a talk to college newspaper editors about the future of journalism. But it seemed to me it was relevant to Clinton's dilemma. She said this, she said, because we are in the midst of such radical change, the most monumental communications change since the invention of the printing press, we can't see clearly what's going on or where we're going. The old journalism is dead, she said, but no one can say what the new landscape will be even 5 years from now. I think Sullivan's observation applies not just to journalism, but to society as a whole. In Clinton's time and in our times, when you're sort of in the middle of something, it's hard to make sense of things. It's hard to get one's bearings. Clinton's dilemma is also the historian's dilemma. When I wrote about Franklin Roosevelt, the Depression was over, the war was over, Roosevelt had long since left the scene. But the transformative era of which Clinton was a part is still unfolding with no end in sight. There's no end of the story yet. The issues he dealt with at home and abroad are still playing themselves out. As a result, there's no consensus, scholarly or otherwise, about NAFTA, welfare reform, Clinton's deregulation initiatives, or anything else. There's just debate, and it's as intense as it was at the time. Even those who served in the Clinton administration can't agree. Janet Yellen, who has just taken over as chair of the Federal Reserve, served as head of Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors in the last couple of years of his administration. So did Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. Both are admirers of President Clinton. Yellen, however, has co-authored a book with another Clinton economic advisor, a book entitled The Fabulous Decade, extolling the accomplishments of Clinton in the 1990s. Stiglitz's book is entitled The Roaring 90s, and he compares the Clinton administration to the 1920s, another Gilded Age of excess, misplaced priorities, and missed opportunities. Clinton had, I really believe that Clinton had a deeper, sort of more sophisticated understanding of what was going on than most of his political peers. He understood what a fundamental transformation we were going through. And to his credit, I think he also acknowledged that neither he nor anyone else was fully in control. He was at the mercy of forces beyond his control. And also to his credit, he took a long view of history rather than sort of being mired in the present. He looked at history as a continuum with a past and a present and a future. At times, he almost sounds to me, as I read him, like a 19th century Whig, like Henry Clay, taking a longer view of how we are connected to the past and the present. But because of the way we evaluate presidents, taking the long view is probably not enough to get him now or later into the front ranks of American presidents. It's nevertheless, I think, a valuable legacy of his, an example as is an example of his very survivability. I want to conclude sort of on a personal note, if I might. Every chance I get, I like to make things all about me. So here is my chance. I want to conclude by telling you about how Clinton, in a small way, got me into the national news. In 2000, his last year in the presidency, he was visiting a bookstore in San Jose, California, the only remaining bookstore in San Jose, California, and he stayed there for 30 or 40 minutes and talked to the bookstore owner, and then came away with a half a dozen books, the names of which reporters dutifully reported in newspapers, the Washington Post and elsewhere. And one was a Jeff Shera book, another was a Tom Clancy novel, but one of them was my Roosevelt book. There's a little bit more to the story. What the reporters didn't note is that the owner of the bookstore was my sister-in-law. And to say that Clinton sort of plucked my book from the shelf is probably not fully accurate. Secret Service or not, my sister-in-law was not about to let him out of the bookstore without my book. When I was on the way here from Boston, in fact, I sort of got wondering if Air Force One has those pockets, in front of the seats where they have catalogs and emergency directions and the air sickness bags. And if so, I was thinking that, my book still might be in one of those pockets. With that, I thank you very much.